And so now we're going to bring on the second half of our presentation, and that's going to be with Andrea Neal. Ms. Neal earned her bachelor's degree from Brown University, History and Latin American Studies. She was a journalist and editor at United Press and the Indianapolis Star for 22 years. And then she became a teacher in 2003 and now teaches language arts and history at St. Richard's Episcopal School in Indianapolis. So this part she didn't pay me to say, but I'm going to tell you, she is the author of 2 books, one of which is a biography of Mike Pence, and the other talks about historic places to visit in Indiana, available at your local bookstore or Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. She is also on the board for the Benjamin Harrison Presidential House as well. So for this session, Ms. Neal is going to introduce us to some lesson plans, some teaching strategies to bring this First Amendment into our classroom. And so we are very pleased to introduce Andrea Neal.
Thank you, Tim. I know many of you don't have your cameras on. A little bit later in the presentation, I do want to put you in breakout rooms. So if you're off making dinner, try and come back in time to do the breakout part of the lesson. I think one of the challenges of We the People is hearing these expert scholars and then figuring out how to take it back to the classroom and use it in a way that's relevant for our students. So that's what I'm going to talk about in my portion today. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my We the People experience first, because I know some of you maybe experienced We the People teachers, but others have not yet begun teaching We the People. And really, it is We the People that has kept me in the teaching profession. I was a career changer. I started my life as a journalist for both UPI and the Star. I was one of those children who idolized people like Neal and Bob Woodard and Carl Bernstein. I came from a newspaper family, and I really saw the press as the most meaningful way to make a difference in the world around me. But when I worked at the Star, it got taken over by the Gannett chain, and the chain newspaper life was not for me. And I started looking for a second calling. And I took one of those personality tests that you fill in your interests and your talents and see what pops out the other end. And what popped out the other end was teaching. And in fact, teaching and journalism have a lot in common. You start each day with sort of a blank slate of possibilities, and I've really loved both careers. I was not a We the People teacher my first year teaching history because I didn't know about it. And a We the People teacher from Tech by the name of Toby Elmore dropped off a We the People textbook and said, you know, you can teach We the People in 8th grade, and I think you'd love it. And I went to the Summer Institute the following summer, and I began teaching We the People my second year as a teacher. And I'm getting to retirement age. I've thought many times that I'm getting close, and what keeps me going back is how much I love teaching We the People, how much students love it, how I feel like if they don't get it from me and the We the People curriculum, they're not going to be getting this material. So that's kind of my We the People spiel. For those of you who teach We the People already, you know that we don't get to the First Amendment until rather late in the curriculum. In the middle division, it's Unit 5, same for high school. And I'm often behind schedule by the time I get to Unit 5. That's too bad, because the First Amendment section of the textbook is rich. The supplemental activities are rich. There's enough material that you could spend several weeks on the First Amendment, but most of us don't have that luxury. And so the question is, how can you take this important First Amendment, particularly free expression material, and help your students understand it, apply it, use it, be able to cite it in competition when you have very little time to learn it. So I'm hoping today that we can sort of talk about that and strategize how to make the First Amendment come alive for your students in a matter of days or perhaps a week or two. So I'm going to share my screen and sort of walk through how I introduced the expression clauses to students. And we will talk through the best way to introduce freedom of the press to students And then we're going to talk about a social media case that I think students love. And many of you may be familiar with, but that's what I'm going to put you in breakout rooms to discuss. So, okay, I am now screen sharing, and I'll make this bigger. Okay, so does that look okay on everybody's screen? So often when I'm teaching the First Amendment, I'll just begin with images and show a slide such as this and ask students, what do you see? What kind of rights are at play? And get them talking about what freedom of speech means symbolically. And of course, we'll read the text of the First Amendment. I don't know about you, but I almost always make Unit 5 memorize the First Amendment because I think it's important for them to be able to pull out phrases or clauses from it. I think students are often perplexed why the First Amendment has these seemingly distinct topics in them. One, freedom of religion, and the other, freedom of expression. I teach them separately. I try and get them to talk about why practicing religion is a form of expression. But generally, I separate those lessons, and I'm betting most of you do as well. You guys are seeing my, hold on. I need to get that. Well, I think I'll just keep it the way it is. Terms are important to review at the beginning of the First Amendment lesson. And I spend a little bit of time talking about the word press, which many of them don't even know what it means or why it's used in the First Amendment to refer to the news media, which of course is the more common word used today. And some of them don't even understand what an old-fashioned printing press is. I'll often tell them that it's a machine with small metal pieces that are raised and they're backwards, that the letters are movable type that could be manually moved around on a frame. And when all of the letters are put together in the right order, it's coated with ink, and then it's applied to a piece of paper. And that's where the term press came from. And sometimes that's news to students. And of course, newspapers aren't printed that way anymore because they're printed through digital technology. And so it's helpful to talk about that word. It's a great example of where the plain meaning of the First Amendment no longer has the relevance that it did originally. We break down the entire free expression section of the First Amendment. I'll say, what does it mean peaceably to assemble? Can you think of times that you've been involved in a group that has peaceably assembled? We'll talk about petition the government, because I have the luxury of also teaching 8th grade English, which we read Julius Caesar. I'm able to draw their attention to times from the Roman Republic, and that that very language, petitioning the government, was used. And we'll move on to petitioning the government for redress of grievances, terms that are used in Henry IV and in Julius Caesar. And we talk about what is redress. They don't know. What's a grievance? And after we sort of parse or break apart the words, then we'll move on to what does it all mean. So this is a slide that usually provokes some disagreement. That looks better, doesn't it? And I'll read it aloud. The two speakers at the school board meeting, I think we need more money for schools. Shut up, you ugly numbskull. And I'll say, do both speakers at the public meeting enjoy the same rights? And what I'd like to do is kind of open it up right now and ask you what you think your students would say when asked that question, sort of at first impression, at first blush. What do you think most students would say when asked that question?
I think probably students would say that the guy standing up maybe had the right to speak, that he was recognized perhaps by the body. And of course, we've seen so much school board discourse today that today's world, which is different from the past, might color their ideas a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I think most of my students see a distinction between polite speech and profane speech, or obscene speech, or bad words. And usually at this point, I will talk about how just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean it's the responsible thing to do. What would be a better way for that person who doesn't agree to express his disagreement? This is very age and developmentally based. Certainly the high school students will have already thought through this question, but the elementary students and certainly my middle school students may not have necessarily thought through it yet. I pretty quickly move into hypotheticals to see just their reaction. And I often base my hypotheticals off cases, Supreme Court cases or other lower court cases where I can give the students an idea of how the court might work. And so the question I'll ask is, are the following permissible just based on the language that we read? Congress shall make no law. Are the following permissible actions either of speakers or of government? And so the first one I gave them this year was a newspaper reports that the president of the United States is a big fat liar. Should a newspaper be allowed to print this? Which free speech right is involved? And so when I'm asking them which free speech rights is involved, I'm asking them to look, is it peaceably to assemble? Is it to petition the government for redress of grievance? Is it freedom of the press? And most of them will immediately recognize that this is a freedom of the press issue. But some of them will say it's not a very nice thing to report. And then I'll point out that oftentimes the news media accuses people in politics of lying. And in fact, many newspapers have fact-checking services that they use during political campaigns that will, for example, look at what's said in a debate, televised or otherwise. And so then I show them an example of when newspapers have indeed called the president basically a big fat liar. And it certainly happened a lot in 2016. And it has continued through much of the Trump presidency. And through the Biden presidency. I think it's become common practice of the news media to call out presidents when they feel, or press secretaries when they feel they're not telling the truth. I love to give them examples from school. I bet many of you have school-based newspapers. My school does have an 8th grade, actually 7th and 8th graders participate in putting out a monthly newspaper, and those that are on the newspaper staff tend to understand these issues better. I think there's no better way to expose students to understanding freedom of the press than have them exercise it themselves. But I'll have them consider high school students creating a newspaper. It's created off campus. It's not a school activity. It's filled with satire. It's got inappropriate content for younger children. But somehow this newspaper makes it to school and gets passed around. And can the school do anything about it? So I'd like to sort of again ask what you think based on your school environment, what your students are likely to say when asked if they can be punished for circulating a paper like this. Anybody?
Some of them would probably argue that they can circulate it because First Amendment, but then again, they're not realizing that the rules are different at school.
Okay. So again, I will give them, it actually happened. Now, this was not a Supreme Court case. This was it did get to the Circuit Court of Appeals level, but a school did publish a newspaper modeled after the National Lampoon. They did spend some school time working on it, even though they probably shouldn't have been, and they did consult with a teacher. The community complained about the hard times newspaper that the students in Granville had published. And the principal, just knee-jerk reaction, suspended them. And the parents, much like they did in the Tinker case, went to court to defend these students. The appeals court reversed the suspension, noting that this was a off-campus activity, and using Tinker as the precedent, this appellate court held that a student is allowed to speak his mind when the school day ends, and that this particular case, the facts of this case, did suggest that this was not a school-based activity and was not disruptive of the school environment. Now, that might be a case that you wouldn't use with elementary students, but certainly middle and high school students would be interested in that case. And then I go to essentially the Skokie case, because again, my students, and I bet a lot of yours, have read recently either Holocaust literature, or they've been thinking about issues involving genocide, which have been a lot in the news. And this year, when I asked this question, almost all of the students wanted the march to be stopped. And so when they find out that the march was allowed to proceed, they start to get a little agitated. Now, this is where, we talk about cases like Brandenburg v. Ohio, and they really struggle with this notion that free expression may be protected even if it's ugly, even if it's bigoted, racist. Their instinct is to not to want to allow that speech to be protected under the First Amendment. So this case, most of you are probably familiar with, and I think what's interesting about it is greater effort was spent on the court case than was spent on the actual rally that eventually occurred. By the time it happened, enough negotiation had occurred. By the time the courts had said, you've got to take the First Amendment more seriously, enough negotiation occurred that the organizers moved the rally to Chicago. Hardly any Nazis showed up, but plenty of those supporting the Jewish community and opposing the Nazis were there. And I talked to students about how sometimes when ugly speech is being allowed, very, very few people are engaging in that speech, and they often get drowned out by the majority, which takes a more nobler point of view. Obviously, the cases in the textbook are important to learn. In the middle school book, they read Tinker and Hazelwood, Hazelwood being the one newspaper case that the book gives them. The high school book includes Brandenburg, but whether you're in middle school or high school, you've got to teach Brandenburg, because one of the middle school Unit 5 questions is about whether a speaker can be punished if he encourages unlawful action, and there's really no way to get through Unit 5 without teaching it. So even though these are not all press cases, I think students are only able to really think about freedom of the press in this larger context of other free speech rights. In fact, I thought it was really interesting when Professor Bryant pointed out the standard in the Pentagon Papers case. It's kind of close to the standard in Brandenburg. So this gets to the part where we're going to have participant participation and talk about the Brandy Levy case. If you know this case already, and if you've taught this case, and when you get in your group, I'm going to ask that you sort of pretend that you don't and view the facts as sort of a case of first impression, because I think it'll make for a better simulation of what would happen in the classroom. But I did teach this case this year to middle school students, and I think it's appropriate for middle school or high school. Elementary teachers, you might have to come up with some other kind of scenario. But this is a situation that occurred very recently. A cheerleader didn't make the varsity team. She went on Snapchat and she went on a rant, foul-mouthed message, pictured herself extending her middle finger. She complained, she used foul language about the school. She complained about cheerleading. And I'm not a Snapchat person, but my understanding of Snapchat is it disappears, but some of it got screenshot and preserved and shared. And so the administration of the school was able to see it. And she was suspended from the junior varsity squad, which she did make. And they cited their policy prohibiting negative information regarding cheerleading, cheerleaders, or coaches placed on the internet. So Brandy's family sued the school. It's interesting. Families usually go after their protection of their children's First Amendment rights. And so these are the questions that I think students should talk about. What free speech right is involved? So they're looking at the language in the First Amendment. What are the competing rights and interests in this case? The Unit 5 really gets them thinking that way. What is the school's interest? What is the student's interest? What is the parent's interests? Is there an obvious common good? Obviously, the First Amendment doesn't protect the common good, but in We the People, the students have been talking about that from day one. What is it? Which side should prevail and why? So at this point, for those of you who are still actually with us, would you mind putting your video cameras on so we can put you in a couple of breakout rooms? And here's what I would love to have happen in the breakout rooms. And we're going to give you about 7 minutes. Because I think it's important to have a little interaction. First, in your breakout room, if you would go around and introduce yourselves, say where you teach and what you teach, and whether you teach We the People. I think that would be nice to do. And then just talk through this case. Imagine this case happened at your school. What would be the right response? And then we'll come back into group and full group. And I'd like to have every breakout room have someone just report back what you all talked about.
All right, Andrea, I think we're all back from the breakouts now.
Great. Well, let's report out. We'll just go in order. There were 3 breakout rooms. If you could just sort of summarize your discussion and what you concluded. And then we'll find out how the Supreme Court ruled. So group 1.
Yeah, we were, the idea that it was kind of a slippery slope, our kids kind of, the idea of, okay, we brought some of the stuff from Tinker, is it something that's going to cause a disruption? So if it's going to be a disruption, then we're going to have an issue. Kids not having a very clear idea what hate speech is, and then how their rights change when they're doing something school related. And that was kind of some of the stuff that we had brought up.
Group 2?
Yeah, we had similar things we talked about. The first thing was, talking about the Tinker test, what it violated that. The question brought up was where it was the message originated from. Was it school grounds or not? And does that make a difference on it? And also, the main difference being that when we talk about violating social norms versus violating legal ones of First Amendment rights.
And group 3.
We discussed similar things, obviously, and there were differing views as far as which side was right, and I thought our group did a good job of talking about those different interests that the student would have, as well as the school administration especially would have, and we also tied it to Tinker.
Okay, great. It's an important case to teach because it is the latest Supreme Court precedent on free speech rights of students. Professor Bryant, I assume, will agree with me that it's not a freedom of the press case, that the student going on Snapchat did not turn her into a journalist worthy of am I right? Although if she pretended to be a reporter, covering the unfairness of the school's cheerleading selection process, that might change the analysis, right?
Yeah, actually, just on that point, I mean, I had not stressed this as much as I might have, but the modern jurisprudence, you and I talked about this a little, Andrea, doesn't really make too much of a distinction between press and speech and actual application. You know, I mean, there have been some efforts to get the court to recognize the press as a category that is needful of and entitled to certain kind of special treatment. But the court has been pretty reluctant to do that, and has kind of adopted the, for lack of a better, you know, comparison, the kind of Protestant, you know, every person is her own reporter kind of approach.
And in the age of the internet, that there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking of people like Matt Drudge, who really was just a citizen acting like a journalist. And so in this case, it's just a general free speech right. So group one predicted what the court was going to rule, but I know group two is probably going to be disappointed with what the court ruled, because it'll be an interesting, difficult explanation with students. But here it is. Let's say share my screen again, and here's the ruling. Okay, can you guys all see that? It was almost unanimous. I think it was Clarence Thomas who was the dissenter, which is kind of funny, because she spoke in circumstances where her parents, not the school, had responsibility, and her speech did not cause substantial disruption or threaten harm to the rights of others. Thus, her off-campus speech was protected, and the decision to suspend her violated her First Amendment rights. So what I would tell the students is, this is a great victory for freedom of speech of students. It's probably the best news for freedom of speech since Tinker, because since Tinker, there was a rather gradual chipping away of First Amendment rights, Hazelwood being sort of an example of that. But if you're worried about whether students give up their rights at the schoolhouse gate, as stated in Tinker, this court ruling makes clear again that they don't. And so probably a good idea to wrap this ruling in a discussion about rights versus responsibility. I'm curious what some of you would say to students so they wouldn't view this as just giving them carte blanche to go put things on social media about their school systems. Does anybody have thoughts on that? Because it seems to give students permission to get on Snapchat or TikTok and do some pretty awful things.
I would say for that is it didn't cause a disruption, a substantial disruption. In other words, it was probably out there. It was quick. Like you said, Snapchat, it goes out there and it goes away. Usually, unless people take a screenshot, I could see saying, okay, now if this had caused a substantial disruption at the school, you know, kids got into a fight with her or they whatever, then there could have been a very different ruling. And kind of say, you know, if you're going to make comment, again, that you have the freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom from consequences, you know. And so if you make a thing and something bigger happens, you know, you've got to take on those consequences of that.
I taught this case this year. I teach a constitutional law class in addition to other stuff. And it was so ironic because one of my students got suspended right after I taught this case. And a dean did something he didn't like. And so he created a fake Instagram page about her and thought he was protected, you know, under the Levy case. And but he did it at school using the school's Wi-Fi, you know, so that netted him a 5-day suspension plus 2 days of in-school reassignment after that, you know, so the school hit him pretty hard. And he'd been in trouble before. He was a veteran.
Yeah, I sometimes, when I start teaching the Bill of Rights, I have students, I give them a little chart and I list each of the amendments. And then I have a column to the right. and I make them write down a responsibility that attaches to the right. So, I mean, using the Second Amendment as an example, yeah, I have a right to own a handgun. What's my responsibility? If I buy a handgun, to get training, to put it in a lockbox so that children won't have access to it. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to talk about free speech in the exact same way. I mean, my school's really got a hard line against bullying, and students don't always recognize the difference after you teach them the First Amendment, right? I've got a right to say what I want to say, but in a school setting, there are other considerations. So it's a good case. It's a fun case because, you know, she did naughty things. So students love to learn about it. And I think that's sort of the introduction to the expressive clauses in the First Amendment. We've got about 15 minutes. I'm going to try. Yes, Professor.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing that also might be worth bringing forward and talking with students about the Levy case is that, you know, the First Amendment protects against governmental punishment, if you will, of speech, but it doesn't protect against, you know, generally speaking, it doesn't protect against private, you know, reaction to it. And so, for example, you know, what might be really valuable for students to keep in mind is, boy, you know, there's nothing that would prevent certainly a private school from, you know, considering this in her application to college, right? Or whether she gets a scholarship, or whether, you know, whether an employer decides to hire, stuff like that. And so it's kind of worth sort of saying that, you know, even though maybe the school as a public school couldn't take a formal sanction against her, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it's without consequence.
Thank you. So in the time remaining, and I'm going to try and use no more than about 8 minutes of it, so there can be questions or you can get off to dinner, to share some lesson plans that drill down to the issue of the day, which is freedom of the press. And when Tim and I first talked about doing this, I struggled a little with how do you pull freedom of the press out and prove that it's really worth separate discussion from the other expressive clauses. And the Bar Foundation already had a great lesson plan on that I'm going to show you. I love the National Constitution Center and some of their lesson plans. And then after my get together with Professor Bryant, I actually wrote up a new lesson plan. I haven't tried it yet, so it's not piloted. So, but I thought I would show it to you, offer it, maybe get a little feedback from you. And all of these, I think, will be made available in doc form. So you can get in them, change them, turn them into your own stuff, come up with something that's a lot better, and use it in your class. But I think it's worthy of pulling the freedom of the press out and having a day or two or three to treat it on its own. So I'm going to show you two of the lesson plans that I like that others offer, and then I'm going to show you the lesson plan that I wrote up. So I love the National Constitution Center. And they have a really nice section on the First Amendment. And okay, so I got way too much on my screen. So classroom learning materials, First Amendment, and they break them down into nice, you can see here, different questions, including the religion clauses. And I'm especially interested for the purposes of today's discussion in both their press and their assembly and petition sections, because my lesson plan is based on both. And I'm just going to show you the freedom of the press one. So if you don't use the Constitution Center learning materials now, you'll get an idea of what's there. And it's a ton of great stuff. So this is the question for this lesson. The guiding questions at the top of the lesson are great. What was the founding generation's vision for the First Amendment's protection of free speech and a free press? Key periods in history that have tested the nation's commitment to free speech. All the We the People lessons can give the students support to answer any of these questions. How has the Supreme Court interpreted it, and how has it changed over time? Professor Bryant's lesson was great for that. And then analyzing free speech and free press cases today. They link to great videos. They've got Tinker. They've got others. They've got a video on the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is great because the Sedition Act is so important as we talk about the free press in the early republic. They'll have interviews with scholars. I can't remember what this one is, but I'm not going to show any. I just wanted you to see what was there. If you've not explored the interactive Constitution, do so. A lot of downloadable stuff, slides, worksheets, lesson plans, articles, and I use some of the articles in the lesson plan that I'm going to share, but just really great stuff. Okay, what's the next thing I'm going to share? The next thing is, oops, no, that's not it. I'm looking for your lesson. Okay, let me close that out. Too much on my screen. Here it is. Whee! Okay, am I still sharing?
No.
I'm not. Oops, I got to share again. Okay, here we go. There we go. Tim, how long has this lesson plan been available?
It's new for Indiana. We put it out in Ohio a couple years ago.
Okay,
So I kind of updated it a little bit.
I loved it. This, if you only have a day or two, I would use this because it gets them to thinking about the questions that they're going to have to answer in Unit 5. But the compelling question, I love the format of this and everything about it, by the way, is the freedom of press the most important right in the First Amendment? And that's certainly debatable. The supporting questions are great. Even if you don't use this lesson plan, I think I would use those 3 supporting questions to introduce the next lesson plan I'm going to show you. Do you see? I'm going to admit somebody who just entered the waiting room. I hope.
Got it.
Okay. I loved the performance tasks. I thought they would be fine either as part of this full lesson or even as standalone activities that you could bring into a First Amendment lesson. The idea of asking questions of a government official. Oh, what a great, I'm definitely going to try some of these next year. And then the Supreme Court precedents that you want to do. The summative performance task is to craft a 4-minute oral response answering the question. So a nice, easy lesson plan that I think you can do in one class period. So I'm going to get rid of that one. And then okay, I got to share again. And then this is the one I wrote. And I'm not going to belabor it because certainly you can read through it and decide if you are interested in using it. But I want to share with you some of the resources that I used in preparing this lesson plan. But the idea is to set up a debate, a 2-sided debate with one group having to argue that freedom of the press matters more and the other having to argue that the right to petition and assembly matter more. And I'm glad the professor's here because I want him to weigh in on this because as we parse those words in the expression clauses of the First Amendment, it looks like petition and assembly are separate rights. And it seems like they are. If I write a model bill and submit it to my lawmaker and say, I hope you'll introduce that, that seems like that's the right of petition. And if I stand outside the State House and urge the legislature to pass something, that seems that's the right of assembly. But it's my best understanding that at least in modern times, the Supreme Court is sort of grouping them all together.
Yes. They are historically quite distinct rights. Petition, they derive from different backgrounds. Petition, you could petition Parliament and the King in colonial, and in fact, if you look like the American Revolution, there's a history of a lot of petitions, and that being a big important place for expression of discontent with the various taxing and coercive acts and things like that. So that's kind of a formal meaning. And assembly is assembly, like what you would think. I mean, it's gathering, Yeah. And so they are kind of distinct things. But you're right. In the modern jurisprudence, the court has sort of lumped them into complaining, the right to complain.
So my thinking behind this lesson plan is get students thinking about how these distinct rights really can hold government accountable. And so the way I've designed it is you'll either argue in favor of freedom of the press or in favor of the rights of petition/assembly. But I like the alliteration of press versus petition, so that's what I call it. So what I've offered here with this lesson plan is a little bit of background material, some suggestions for historical material that they can use to support them in the debate. Again, I don't want to go over, so I'm just going to run through it. Depending on how you do it, it could take up from 2 to 4 50-minute class periods. I want to show off this book. Obviously, you're going to use the textbook. I'm suggesting 2 articles that I found at Bill of Rights Institute and Constitution Center that I thought were extremely helpful as background information. This is called The Birth of the First Amendment. It's by Donna Griffin. It's illustrated by Gary Varvel. It's edited by me, but it's a graphic novel about the John Peter Zenger case. And it's pretty easy to understand summary of the case with really great back matter that talks about important Supreme Court cases involving freedom of the press, important muckrakers who've made a difference. And I find it a very useful teaching tool. And unfortunately, it's expensive because Donna self-published it through an organization, a not-for-profit organization that she heads, but called the Urban Media Project. But you can get a paperback edition for $20, and you just go to birthofthefirst-amendment.org. So I like it, and my students like it in Unit 5. I have 3 copies, and I have the Unit 5 students pass it around. So just a little bit of background material. I've got the instructions. We're going to put them in debate teams. They have to argue one of the sides. I want to make sure they've got good research skills already. So I probably will have spent some time showing them oye.org. Probably all of you are already familiar with it, but boy, it is the quickest place to go to get Supreme Court precedents in abstract form. They need some historical background that only you can provide. But then I would set them on their own to research the historical examples. You can provide the examples. So the ones that I chose for those who are arguing in favor of freedom of the press as the most potent First Amendment tool is I've chosen James Callender. It is not taught enough, but he's the guy who originally reported that Thomas Jefferson had children with an enslaved woman at Monticello. But he made both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans mad. He was jailed for violating the Sedition Act, and it's just a great case. And it also shows that today's misinformation can be tomorrow's truth, because he was dismissed. Jefferson had some crazy word salad about how if I were to acknowledge the things that are false, then how would people know what was true? Jefferson said something crazy. And yet DNA tests proved his original 1802 reporting to be correct. So it's a great case for them to learn. Obviously, Watergate is great. And then 2 of the precedents that Professor Bryant shared with us today, New York Times v. Sullivan and the Pentagon Papers. So the students are going to have to cite at least 1 historical example and 1 Supreme Court precedent in their debate to get all their points. Then on the other side, we've got the right of petition and assembly. Again, give them the historical background going all the way back to British constitutional law. Historical examples, as early as 1790, Quakers petitioning Congress about abolitionist issues. National Women's Party protest outside the White House, that's fun. March on Washington, 1963, that's a good one that you're probably teaching already anyway. And then I chose these 2 Supreme Court precedents, but there are lots more that you can find in your resources. One involved students who were, involved citizens who were essentially socialists, and the city was trying to keep them from meeting. And the other involved Black students who were protesting racial segregation laws, and were charged with breach of peace. So they're really good cases that students can get into. This is just the format of the debate. You know, they need main argument, historic examples, court cases. They'll have a rebuttal. Here's a little rubric, blah, de blah, and that is it. You all have lots of great resources at your disposal, I know, and you could adapt almost any good free speech court case to these lesson plans, and use these lesson plans to teach them the precedents that you think are most important. I'm going to stop talking because we are about out of time.
Well, I want to say thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate both of your time and expertise to share that with us.